And welcome inside this week opening edition of Big Ten Today, presented by Gatorade. Rick Pizzo, Nicole Auerbach, Howard Griffith. Apparently we're still playing in places like South Bend, Bloomington, Evanston. We have overtimes everywhere. We have dramatic finishes everywhere. And I think maybe for the first time since we saw Alabama not be as good as we expected, the national picture has changed a little bit at the very top, Nicole, inside that top 5 or 6.
Yeah, we finally gotten some clarity. A lot of those teams have played good teams, and that's really helped. As someone who has to try to figure out a top 10 every Saturday night, it's very complicated. But games like the one we had in South Bend certainly do a lot for figuring out what we know about these teams.
And that's important, right? Because we talk about this Ohio State team having an opportunity to play in the playoffs along with Michigan, but we hadn't seen them play that caliber team. And it turns out that, yeah, they were taken to the brink, but they found a way to be able to pull out a win.
Now, they started the season, did Ohio State, ranked number 3 in the preseason, but they slowly dropped down a couple. No losses, but maybe just not that explosiveness that we had come to expect from Ryan Day's team. Well, back up the ladder. As we show you today's big story, it is the Associated Press Week 5 poll. Top 5 and Big Ten teams. You see the Buckeyes up from 6 to 4. Now, Penn State just keeps blowing people out. The Nittany Lions can barely start to rise. They started the year at 7, stayed there for a long time, now up to number 6 after throttling Iowa over the weekend. Michigan staying put at number 2. See 7, 8, and 9, all future Big Ten schools. I'm not sure that anybody had a more impressive win in the country than Oregon this past weekend. Maybe changed a little bit about what we think about Coach Prime. That is a conversation for a different show. Our conversation does focus on Ohio State. Howard, there are so many different layers that we could get into here, whether it's Notre Dame having 10 guys on the field for the last 2 games, Ryan Day verbally jousting with an 80-year-old former head coach. Though the octogenarian did start it.
That was my favorite part.
Fair.
There were a lot of coaches teeing off on octogenarians this weekend.
But at the end of the day, I think the most important aspect of this win, Howard, was that it was tough. It was on the road, and the last play was symbolic. We're just going to run it up the gut, and we're going to be tougher than you.
Yeah, and regardless of how many people were on the field, I think when you look at the way they played this game, I think they had to be physical. This was a Notre Dame team that wanted to run the football at them, and they had some success doing it. But they didn't give up the big play. One of the things that we saw that was characteristic going back to last year about this Ohio State team, so they kept everything in front of them. They made the plays when they had opportunities to, and then your quarterback stepped up, and when he needed to connect with the receivers to make some plays, extend, he was able to do it.
Yeah, it was a phenomenal final drive for Kyle McCord, a definitive final drive. And we've been wondering about him, and we watched him get better and more comfortable in this offense. But to do what you did in that environment and to complete those 3rd down passes, the 4th down, but again, like they were just really high pressure moments, and he delivered. And to your point, Rick, I loved that it was a run up the gut to win the game, because especially seeing how emotional Ryan Day was afterwards and the points that he wanted to make about the physicality of this team, that was the important part, that they actually could do that they could say, we have 1 yard to get, and we can just push, we can physically get our running back in that end zone and get that yard. And I just think that is something that this is a team that has been knocked for. Maybe they've used different language than Lou Holtz, but
slightly.
But it's really been a narrative since Michigan beat them the first time, right? And that has been something that Ryan Day and this program have had to prove. We had that conversation actually after the Notre Dame game last year, because we thought that they had proved that, and the way they were physical, the way they ran the ball in the second half of that game. But that was the statement. That's why they ran the ball in that moment.
Does that change then the way that we should look at this Ohio State offense moving forward? Because before the year started, I know that everyone had questions about Kyle McCord, but there was still Marvin Harrison. There was still those 2 guys in the backfield. There was still Emeka Ibuka. We still expected this to be the offense that we saw with C.J. Stroud and with Justin Fields and with Dwayne Haskins and with quarterbacks before him. Is what we saw on Saturday night what we should expect from this team for the rest of the year?
Well, it was a low-scoring game. So, there were certain parts of the game that I don't think will be necessarily replicated, and I think that you'll still need to prove that you can handle the front that Michigan brings, right? But do I feel better about, a matchup with Penn State? Yes. Okay. Do I think that there was balance, and we saw them get those explosive plays from both, but also just the clutch plays of making those passes to different receivers, by the way, even after Marvin Harrison got hurt? I think all of that was really encouraging. But again, the question of Michigan and the physicality in that game, that's always going to be different, and you're not going to have that answer until the end of the season.
I think the fact that Kyle played so well when they needed him to was a step in where this team needs to go offensively. Because remember, the three guys you just mentioned that were future first-rounders, that were first-round picks in the NFL, they all struggled too. And they struggled mightily in some of those games. And it took time for them to become not only the starting quarterback, but the starting quarterback at Ohio State, which is a pressure cooker. And we saw that from their coach at the end through his comments. But they're growing. So it's about being able to continue to build. They haven't gotten to the point where they're just, running and controlling the line of scrimmage. They're still not doing that. So let's be clear there. But I think it's the way they play the game. It's who they are. And we're looking at it also, but what happened, as you just mentioned, versus a Michigan, versus a physical team. So it's not that they can't be physical. It's just the way they want to play the game.
I know you and I have had this conversation. We had it when we were on the tour at Michigan and at Michigan State. We've had it a little bit in the preseason. And I know before the year started, we were both very high on Penn State. Still thought Michigan was the favorite. We both thought Ohio State was going to be the third best team in the East. I know it's early. I know it's one game, but it is a road game against a top 10 opponent. Does this kind of change that for you at all? Because it does for me a little bit. I now feel like I want to put Ohio State and Penn State in the same category as opposed to I had Penn State a little bit higher. And not to take anything away from Penn State.
Right.
We'll get to their blowout win in a second.
I think that's fair. I think you can have a 2A and a 2B. Right, but it's clearly there's not a lot of separation there between those two teams. The talent gap is still what it is, but I think the way they're playing the game, this is going to be an unbelievable matchup because I think they both want to play the game the same way.
Another thing that was really impressive is Ohio State's defense, right? We've talked so much coming into this game about what Sam Hartman has done, how prolific the offense has been for Notre Dame. And so, again, the first half was weird. It was low scoring. It was not how I expected that game to go. But I do think we learned about the defense. And this is something that, again, we wait usually, and we saw last year. We felt pretty good about it until the end of the season. But this was a good offense. This is an offense that can beat you with the pass, that can beat you on the ground. And Ohio State held their own in that phase as well. So again, when you're looking for reasons to be excited and to possibly reevaluate the ranking of those top three, that factors in too.
Yeah, I think what the secondary was able to do, they really didn't give up those big plays. They were challenged, but incomplete.
175 yards for Hartman. He gets out of bed and he throws for 175 yards against most teams. That's a terrific performance. And here come the Penn State fans who are probably a little bit upset with me maybe moving Ohio State back into that 2B category because they have a legitimate argument. We played a good team. We played a team that was inside the top 25, and we blew Iowa out. The Hawkeyes had no chance in this game. Penn State just continues to roll the way that we have seen Penn State roll throughout the course of the year. 31-0. Drew Aller didn't have to throw for a ton of yards, a lot of underneath stuff, but he didn't turn the ball over. And that's saying something, right, against an Iowa defense that absolutely feeds on turnovers. Penn State has been as advertised, and they've been so good offensively, we're not talking nearly enough about that Manny Diaz defense.
Nobody's talking about him, including nationally. They're not talking about him.
And they should be.
Yeah, they're not talking about him at all. But I think they're really playing a balanced game. When you talk about complementary football, they're getting it done in all phases. And you're right, you bring up Manny Diaz's defense. They're continuing to get better. I think that's a defense that's going to continue to elevate. And they have so many players over there that, they can shut teams down. They really can, particularly when you talk about playing a team that struggles offensively. We'll get to them later. But I really like where they are right now. Penn State is doing an unbelievable job in all phases of the game. And can they get better in certain areas? Absolutely. Everybody can. But for where they are right now, they're continuing to win and blow out and dominate teams. That's what they need to be doing.
Yeah, it's scheme, but it's also talent. It's all of those things. Because we talked getting into the season about individual talents in the defense, right? Especially in the back end and actually in all phases. But it's such a good unit. And the preparation and the way that they're playing is so good. And James Franklin went out of his way in the post game to talk about Manny Diaz and what he has done on that side of the ball. But there's also something, it's just hard to do what they did, even against an offense that is struggling. 4 first downs.
76 yards total.
76 yards. That is, it's shocking, the numbers that there are there. And it's, again, we're going to talk about what that means for Iowa, but that is an incredible achievement for Penn State defense, even at home, even in a whiteout environment that we know they get up for that, and they're individual players who just thrive in that situation. That's still really hard to do in those elements, in that moment, against a good team, even if you know that you're going to have an advantage defensively, to actually just totally stifle them.
And I know it was at home, and that would be the counter. Oh, Drew Aller hasn't played in a really nasty road environment yet. I understand that, but you played against a defense that confuses the best quarterbacks in the country and has done so for a decade plus. So to me, Howard, even though his yardage per completion was down in comparison to previous games, he threw for 4 touchdowns, he didn't throw a pick, and he gave what the defense was offering, which to me is the sign that a young quarterback has progressed to the point where he has to be if he's going to lead a championship football team.
Yeah, you don't have to force the football, right? Take exactly what they're giving. And that's a maturity that you need to have as a quarterback, particularly when you know you have a big arm and you want to take advantage of things, or at least you want to test the secondary and go after it. But it's really about staying inside of the game plan. And I'll tell you the other thing that I think is really, yes, we can sit around and say, well, Iowa's this, but they play against their own defense every day in practice. And they're getting great looks from that defense. So you talk about an offensive line that's challenged by that defensive line. The corners and wide receivers are challenged. So they're practicing on a daily basis against a really good defense. So I think that's going to pay dividends as they continue to move forward.
Yeah, again, I've been impressed by Drew Aller. I also thought he responded well, because we saw him struggle for the first time. Under 50% completions against Illinois. That was a road environment, right? So you're looking for little experiences for him to get under his belt, so that when he plays Ohio State, when he plays Michigan, he'll be ready. So not making mistakes. And gaining that confidence, getting the ball to where it needs to be, and control the game. I mean, obviously, that was something Penn State did right out of the gate. Right. That's what you want. That's what you're asking for from your quarterback as you're continuing to get him more experience.
Listen, Iowa did what it had to do first 3 games of the year. That's why they were inside the top 25, because they won the games that they were supposed to win. They were not remarkably impressive in doing so. And now I think we now need to take a step back and evaluate what's realistic for Iowa. There were many who were putting this team in the conversation to be a West Division champion. I'm not saying that's out of the realm of possibility, but if this offense doesn't get fixed a little bit, it becomes out of the realm of possibility pretty quickly, even in a clearly wide open West Division.
Yeah, it's a big problem. I mean, again, 4 first downs. This is a big
can't win football games that way.
You can't win. You're also, what was it, 30-something total offensive snaps? I mean, you're not on the field. That's also a huge problem, even when you have a great defense and great special teams, which, by the way, had a couple uncharacteristic mistakes. But you can't put your defense in that position. You can't put the rest of your team in that position. And I know there's injuries, but it's clearly not working. And I understand, Kirk Ferentz and Brian Ferentz digging in and saying, no, we're going to continue to do what we've done. But it's not working, and it's getting worse. And this is shocking to see out of Cade McNamara, because this is so far below the performances that we saw out of him at Michigan. And you just know that there's more meat on the bone there, and they're just not finding it.
Yeah, and I think we all expected this offense to be able to elevate, right? We thought they would have the opportunity to be able to go out and execute, and we're not seeing that. And yes, we talked about Cade not being involved during training camp phase because of the injury, but we thought he was going to continue to get better. It's going to take time, and unfortunately, they're not getting ready to change anything that they're doing. So it comes down to them to be able to execute the plays that they're calling. But they've got to find a way, to manufacture. Oh, wow.
It's Monday morning. It happens. It happens to everybody.
It happens sometimes. But I just think it's one of those things that they've got to find a way. How do you do it? Because at some point, right, you mentioned the defense, you talk about special teams, they're going to have breakdowns.
Yeah.
And it just can't always be about coming through defensively and in special teams.
What's really frustrating, I think, for Iowa fans watching this team is how wide open the West is. And I know we say that basically every year, but especially this year. I mean, Wisconsin has already lost non-conference games. They've got some issues defensively. They're still figuring out their offensive identity. Purdue's down. There's so many other teams, and there's so much opportunity, right? And we say this every year, but it's especially true this year. If Iowa just could have a middle-of-the-pack offense, They would be
the West is out there. If anybody wants
Runaway
it, who wants the West?
I'll take the West.
Minnesota has a 21-point lead against Northwestern, gives it up.
We just can't blow by Ryan Day's post game, right? As excited as he got, just unleashing. We've got to talk about that, don't we?
Fire away.
I think really what we saw, the emotions of Ryan Day, is really what's been bottled up clearly probably for a couple of years, because we've not seen him that emotional about a game, about a victory, since he's been at Ohio State.
Yeah.
It was pretty remarkable, and I think pretty telling of just how much, I don't know if it's pressure, but a relief.
I think part of it's pressure. He knew what that game meant, not just for the program. He knew what that game meant for him.
He knew what the headlines would be Sunday morning if
He's
they
a
don't
smart
win
guy.
that game.
He is a smart guy.
Yeah.
Also a really good coach who's taken a lot of who's won more games in his first 50 percentage-wise than anybody except Walter Camp. And they have a trophy named after him.
Yeah,
so
but this was a big one for him.
I'm just saying,
Huge.
a huge one. Coming up this Saturday, a doubleheader kicks off with number 6 Penn State against Northwestern and Minnesota taking on Louisiana. Those are noon Eastern, 11 Central games. Then unbeaten Maryland squares off with Indiana. Rutgers hosts Wagner in the mid-afternoon window all Saturday on the Big Ten Network and the Fox Sports app. You can go to btn.com/gamefinder for the channel locations in your area. Back at our Big Ten Today studio set, Rick Pizzo, Nicole Auerbach, and Howard Griffith alongside. It seems like, and this is not an offensive statement, I hope, to Rutgers, but it seems like everything in the first month for Michigan was kind of an appetizer leading up to a couple of main courses, those being the dates against Penn State and Ohio State, because we thought so highly of Michigan. And not just us, not just those in the Big Ten geographic footprint, everybody nationally. Yeah. Based on what you saw in this game, Howard, based on what you've seen from Michigan so far, has there been anything to change your mind and your outlook on the Wolverines?
There really hasn't been. I mean, there were some questions I thought that may have popped up as far as what was happening up front in the offensive line. They had some challenges in some earlier games. But this team is right where I think they expect to be. And yes, they haven't had their head coach. He was back on the sidelines, and that's obviously going to be a big help for them as they move forward on game day. But they've answered all the calls. You know, JJ continues to get better. He also this week showed you that he can run, and they will run him every now and then. Did an outstanding job in that phase. This is a pretty good team, and not a pretty good team, a really good team in all phases.
Yeah, and I think Rutgers was a good test. We thought that they would be. We thought that defense is good, and it's going to remain good. I think this is still a Rutgers team where I think you could definitely be bowl eligible and get to play an extra game. So I think seeing those pieces of the offense and then their ability to run the ball when they want to, which we know that they take so much pride in, and Blake Corum getting in the end zone twice, like those things were good. It was just a lot of progress, and they will not have those measuring stick games for a while. Like this schedule is super backloaded. But we're trying to learn about them as they evaluate, as they keep taking these steps. And I think we did see that against a really good defense.
And to me, the little things were much better in this game. The Bowling Green game, they were a little sloppy.
Yes.
JJ made some really questionable decisions. I didn't think the line play was terrific. More penalties than you've become accustomed to. I thought in this game, after they gave up that quick early touchdown, that defense went on lockdown. They didn't just close the gates. They locked the gates. They made sure nobody was anywhere near. They had Dobermans around the gates. The defense, a little bit like Penn State right now, because the stars are on the offensive side and JJ and Blake and Donovan. This defense is really not getting a lot of credit. Nobody in FBS is better. They're allowing less than 6 points per game right now.
Yeah, and again, people are also just discounting it because of the schedule,
Because
right?
of the schedule, right.
But again,
it's that 6 points per game.
Yeah,
That's less
exactly.
than a touchdown a game.
Right, and again, like you can only play the teams on your schedule. It's such a hard argument, especially with some of these, for Michigan and Georgia, games that got canceled on their schedule. They can't control that, but agreed. And Mike Sandersell, we saw him in the pick six here, and I know JJ loved it because he got to see him find the end zone, someone who used to play offense. But he's been the heart of this defense. The defense has a lot of heart. It's a really good unit, and we haven't been talking about them enough because we do want to see things out of the quarterback, and we wanted to see JJ respond from all those interceptions against Bowling Green. But the defense has been rock solid, and it certainly was after the first minute of the game.
And that's what they need to do. They just need to continue to progress the way they are. The defense has been solid. They're well coached. this entire team is well coached. And I think that's one of the reasons they've got the right players making the plays that are needed to be made out there. And they're doing a great job. And it's going to be a fun team.
One thing I think we haven't really hit on is when you talk about well coached, what have we learned? I mean, this was the first game with Jim Harbaugh back. So we were also still just kind of waiting to see, okay, how did they look without him?
Yeah.
All these different people being the head coach for the day. And finally getting Jim Harbaugh back. And he was giddy in the post game. And again, it wasn't like the world's most beautiful win.
Right.
But this is beautiful to him. He likes winning games this way.
And they're undefeated, and the hope is that self-imposed 3-game suspension means when the NCAA has its ruling in 2024, it's more of a slap on the wrist than it is any type of lengthy NCAA-issued suspension. Of course, all of that is conjecture. We're going to have to wait to see what that decision is. Now, everything's pretty good in Ann Arbor. Down the road in East Lansing, that's not the case. Obviously, there's so much going on behind the scenes with Mel Tucker. Today is the 7-day window after Michigan State announced he had 7 days, Mel Tucker did, to respond to their decision to ultimately try to fire him with cause. Harlan Barnett took over in a really tough situation. And then to make matters worse, it's Michael Penix in Washington, a college playoff contender. They get blown out. And then you have to face Maryland with another really good quarterback. I hate to say this, Nicole, but I think this game pretty much went according to script.
It did. It felt exactly what we were expecting out of this game, except for, Maryland did a really good job of not falling behind this game. They were able to kind of jump on Michigan State early, but we've seen just a lot of concerns out of the quarterback position, the offense, and the defense has given up big plays. And that's what we were concerned about coming into this game with Leah, because you did see Michael Penix Jr. pick apart this defense and have a lot of big plays and a ton of passing yards. And this is a really good passing offense. And Leah has basically every Maryland record as a passer. So it did go as according to plan, and I thought it was actually a really encouraging game for Maryland for taking care of business quickly, early, and often.
And I think that's the biggest part. That's the biggest takeaway, the way Maryland was able to perform. Yeah, Michigan State, they've got their own issues over there on and off the football field that these young folks are having to have to deal with, and we don't know which direction that's going in. This is a tough situation for those players and also the coaches to be put in. But Maryland, as you mentioned, not falling behind, taking care of business. And as we see Maryland winning the games they're supposed to, that's what they're doing. And they'll have some opportunities against the big boys. And if they can win one of those, I think Maryland is right where they want to be.
Well, they're back home, right, this weekend against Indiana, I believe. And they'll be heavily favored. You take care of business. You're 5-0 before that Ohio State game. And I know you'll be big-time underdogs, but there have been some occasions where Ohio State and Maryland have been a lot closer in recent years than people have expected. I don't think there's any doubt. Maybe Mike Locksley won't say this publicly. He's had that one circled on his calendar, thinking his team and Ohio State would both be undefeated going into that game because it's a litmus test. Yeah. If you don't win it, how close are you? How competitive are you? He says this team is ready to play for championships. I think we'll probably know after next weekend. All right, let's also touch on the Friday night game. It was Wisconsin and Purdue. Wisconsin has owned this series basically for 2 decades, haven't lost a game to Purdue, 17 straight wins, 38-17. I think, Howard, this is probably the kind of offensive performance that Luke Fickell and Phil Longo envisioned when they got together. They were almost exactly balanced between run yardage, passing yardage. Obviously, some bad news with Ches Malusi, and we'll hope to get an update from Luke Fickell on Monday after a nasty injury. But from this game perspective, I think it's exactly what Fickell and this Badger team wanted to see and needed to see.
And they needed to see it. They needed to be able to see the success of what this offense can do and being balanced, trying to take that on and also trying to move this offense forward, being able to throw the ball. And that's something that they were able to get done in this game. They still have some issues on the defensive side. But that's going to be a work in progress, I think, the entire year.
Yeah, I think that was one of my takeaways coming out of the way the game ended. It should have been over. It should have been in hand, and it wasn't because they were letting Purdue move the ball pretty easily. And then Purdue was making mistakes, which is a problem because the Boilermakers have had a lot of turnovers recently, and it's been a huge problem for them. But I do have some questions about what we've seen out of the Badgers defense, and it may not be a huge issue, as we said, with the West. The West is very open this year. It feels like things are parting for Wisconsin with this offense, especially trying to figure out what it is going to be. But defensively, I do think that's going to be the area that Luke Fickell wants to improve and will continue to focus on.
Let's remember, they're not running the defense that they ultimately want to run. They're putting their players, the best players that they have right now, into a situation that they can coach, but this is not something that
they have players recruited for the previous scheme.
Exactly, and they've adapted their defense to this scheme, and it's going to continue to be a work in progress. They will get better. A
little bit easier to do that on the offensive side when you get a transfer quarterback and you have guys like Allen and Malusi. Purdue, meanwhile, this has to be, and I still think that Ryan Walters is going to be an outstanding head coach. Very young guy who has succeeded every place he's ever been as a coordinator. Took over in a tough spot, but this has to be so frustrating for him to see defensively what this team is doing, or I guess more to the point, Nicole, what this team is not doing on the defensive side of the football.
They're one of the most disappointing units collectively. I think coming into the season, I'm thinking, okay, you're hiring, Ryan Walters, coming off an incredible season with Illinois and what their defense did. That's his identity. Brings in an offensive coordinator, but he'll be involved in that side of the ball. And the drop-off defensively, I think, has been really frustrating. And again, like the mistakes, not being able to get off the field, it's just kind of very basic things that make a defense really good, and they're just not doing them, and they're making the same mistakes repeatedly. And again, just third downs. It's just been a problem all around.
I think one of the things that happens, unfortunately, when you bring in a head coach and he's a defensive-minded person, you immediately think that everything's going to go right from day one, and that's not really reality. It takes time for that system to be implemented totally. Remember, there's a different play caller involved. A lot of things are changing, so they got to get to it, but they can't have the self-inflicted wounds. That's a problem.
And I'm not making an excuse for Ryan Walters here, but this first 4 weeks of a schedule for a first-year head coach taking over a program like Purdue is as hard as you could get. Nobody wants to play Fresno State in week 1. You have to go to Blacksburg, and they pick up a very nice win in week 2. Syracuse, another Power 5 opponent in week 3, and then you start Big Ten play against a team that nobody has beaten in West Lafayette since the Joe Tiller days? I mean, this is a big ask, and I don't think it's a shock to see Purdue at 1-3. Certainly not where Ryan Walters envisioned this team being, but as they say in football, it is what it is. It is time for today's big stat fueled by Gatorade. What in the name of Flynn Nagel was going on Saturday night in Evanston? Bryce Kurtz and the Wildcats, that's what. Kurtz with 215 receiving yards against Minnesota. Only Nagel, Jim Lash, and Todd Sheets have had more receiving yards by a Northwestern player in a single game in program history. Of course, Kurtz and this team part of one of the greatest comebacks in program history, down 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter against a Minnesota team that's really owned the series against Northwestern as of late. They come back, they win it in overtime. I know the bigger story may be the shock that PJ Fleck and the Gophers are feeling, but to me, for Northwestern to be able to do what it did in this game when everybody on the planet, including most folks inside Ryan Field, had given up on them, this team has not given up at all on David Braun. They obviously believe in what this staff and Coach Braun are doing right now.
That was my main takeaway as well, and we saw how emotional he was in the post game, and I would be too.
Sure.
I mean, this is a challenging situation that he has been in ever since he became the interim head coach, and I think, especially with the way they open the season against Rutgers, they get blown out. There's really questions of, okay, are they going to win a game this season? And not only that, they've won 2. They've won a Big Ten game. This was an incredible comeback, which does speak to your faith in the coaching staff, your faith in each other, and I think that there's a lot of confidence that you can build. But this was a stunner, and I think it made a statement to a lot of people about this team not giving up on their season.
Coach Braun said from the very beginning, right, he believes in these players, and the players believe in the system. And they went out and executed. When they could have just shut it down, they came back. Ben Bryant has struggled early in the season, really came back and played well for them. And this was huge for them, a confidence booster, and really something to build on from the Northwestern perspective. Minnesota got a lot of questions, thought this was a much better team defensively, and to lose the way you lost, it's a tough one.
Yeah, you wonder if the conversation now, and I know we're 4 games in, but if the conversation in Evanston starts to become, have we already found our next head coach? I mean, David Braun, based on this start, is probably going to be part of that conversation. Meanwhile, folks are going to overreact. They're going to blame this on PJ Fleck. And certainly, he's always been a guy, to be fair, who takes blame when his team makes the kind of mistakes that it made in this loss. I just think, Howard, this is a team that if you had told me before the year started, they're going to find a running back, Darius Taylor's going to average like 200 yards a week, I'm going to say they're going to win the West.
Yeah.
After a loss like this, I don't think that you would feel comfortable saying that right now.
Yeah, it's tough right now, and they're playing offensively the way they want to. They're doing the things they need to, but they're not able to close it out. Right? Defensively, they just couldn't close it out. So this is really a stunner in so many ways because you don't expect a team coach as well as they are to respond the way they did at the end of this game.
Well, and a program that, again, has had the identity of strong defenses, physical games, and again, that they can run the ball.
Yes.
So how are you giving the other team this many opportunities to come back in a game? There's a lot of questions about that, I think.
Yeah, nearly 500 yards for Northwestern. That doesn't happen a lot for a team to gain 500 yards if you give up a nearly 200-yard rusher in the same game.
Wow.
We get our stats department on that because I'm guessing that has not happened very often in Big Ten history. One other thing that has not happened very often in Big Ten history, to have two primetime games both go to overtime. Now, Northwestern, Minnesota went to 1 overtime. Indiana needed 4 overtimes to beat Akron. I'm not sure, Nicole, if you're Tom Allen, obviously you're happy that you won. I'm not sure you're happy overall when you woke up on Sunday morning about pretty much anything.
No, and it's just such a 180 from how we felt coming out of a loss against Louisville, right? We liked so much of the fight and the comeback in that game, and especially what they discovered offensively with Taven Jackson. He was really good in the Louisville game, and they were, a couple inches away from a different outcome in that one, and then this was just totally different, and even Taven Jackson didn't play well. Offense struggled. And the defense, we have been so impressed by the defense since week 1 against Ohio State that, yes, Rick, you got to be frustrated with everything right now.
They can be frustrated, but they got the win. They found a way to win the game, and I think that's the most.
Let's not understate how important that is.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Because if you lose that game, it's a whole nother conversation this week in Bloomington.
Absolutely. So I think the coaches are in a good situation where they'll be able to coach from a perspective that, yes, we won the game, but here are the things that we have to correct because we probably shouldn't have won the game the way we did.
Yeah, and then you start to look at what Indiana has still remaining on their schedule coming up over the next couple of weeks. We'll know everything we need to know if you don't know it now about what the Hoosiers are and what the Hoosiers can be through the course of 2023. I'm still wondering about what Illinois is. I'll be honest with you. I feel like I was dead wrong. I thought this was a team at the beginning of the year that really wasn't going to take that big of a step back, even with all the talent that they lost. But it seems like, and this sounds weird about a Brett Bielema team, right, Howard? Because one thing that Brett has always done is he's established an identity with his teams each and every year. I'm still not sure what the identity of this football team actually is.
And you're right. Even after the win, you're not quite sure. But I thought what they showed was a lot of resolve because they got down in this game, and they were being schemed. They had them schemed up. Tom Herman had his team playing really well. And Illinois just really early couldn't get the run game going, but then all of a sudden they started to hit some passes. They missed some big opportunities as well, but I think this is an Illinois team that each year you're trying to find out who you are, that identity, and you would like to have it established early, week 1, week 2, but they haven't gotten there yet. I think the thing they figured out is they need to figure out how to get the ball to Isaiah Williams on a consistent basis.
That's a good identity to have.
Yeah, get the ball to him.
Well, and Luke Altmaier also threw for over 300 yards for the first time. So there was definitely a lot to like, but the slow start was a little bit concerning, especially with an FAU team that's starting a new quarterback, and they were going through a lot as well, but the response was really good.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's no Chase Brown, right? There's no Sidney Brown. You had a couple of other defensive backs go in the first round. Tommy DeVito is gone. I know Luke Altmaier has done a very nice job. But all these changes, that's a lot.
It's a lot.
For any program to try to withstand throughout the first month of the season. And we've seen some of those growing pains, certainly, with this particular Illinois team. Growing pains have been the case in Lincoln, but they are growing. Matt Rule, who seems like a remarkably positive guy, by the way, all the time when you hear him talk.
Yeah.
He is seeing, I think, small steps. And to his credit, Nicole, he said when he took over this program, we are going to be an incremental growth program. That's how I do it. You have to stay patient. And we've seen some steps back and then replaced by a step forward. And we saw both, I think, in the win over La Tech.
Yes, and he is a great program builder, and this is why I thought this was such a fantastic hire for Nebraska, and we're seeing it play out because you're seeing those methodical steps happen. The defense is really good. They are really good. They're very physical, and that's what is I think the biggest adjustment from the Scott Frost era to now is having a defense that can tackle, that's prepared, that's in all the right spots. That's going to keep you in games no matter what's happening as they're figuring out things offensively. But you know what's a big advantage, Howard? Not turning the ball over finally as an offense. That is going to also win you games. And again, the quarterback change I think was the right call. And he's done a lot with his arm and on the ground for this offense.
And I think that's where it starts. Taking care of the football, not giving it away, putting your defense in bad positions is what's going to help them have that incremental growth that coach wants to have. And I think that's probably the important part you mentioned about how positive he is. And I think that's what you need to do, because this is a team over the last few years that's been beat up, not only from the front of the room by their own coach, but obviously outside as well. So he understands that. So he's doing a great job of what he needs to do to get this team.
You never want anybody to be injured, but you start to wonder if maybe that ankle injury that Jeff Sims suffered, and then there was no debate, you had to start Harburg in game 3 anyway, is the best thing for this team strictly because of ball security. If you're building a program,
ball's a program.
Can't give that. The ball is the program. Said from the man who knows a thing or two about some ball. All right, time for today's big picture. I love this conversation because it is about which team right now, based on whether it's resume, whether it's eyeball test, whatever you want to put in the mix as far as factors, is the best team in the country on this day. What's today? September the 25th. Of course, everything will change. You want to be the best team in the country on around, I don't know, January 10th. That's probably a little bit more impactful. But, Nicole, let's start with you. Right now, because I know you are a voter, and so you had to submit your top 25. Who's the best team in the country?
So I think that Florida State is the best team in the country, and I put them number 1 because of both the eye test, because they have looked really good, again, with the way that they beat LSU in week 1, and then gutting out that win over Clemson, which, by the way, the Tigers looked good. Like, they fixed some things offensively. That was a good win for Florida State in a really hard place for them to win games. And I think the resume, those 2 wins are better than anybody else's 2 wins so far. So I think you need to reward them now that you've got enough teams in that mix, in that top 10 range, that have actually started to play really hard opponents. I think you have to evaluate that when you're doing the rankings. I do think people will justify keeping it Georgia, Michigan at the top, but you have enough data points now. You could change that. So I decided to change that and to base it on the resume.
You can justify anything you want. You can come up with a reason to have anybody you want at number 1 that has a 0 in the loss column right now.
You could put like 8 different teams at number 1 right now, and I wouldn't really have an issue with it.
But to me, that's what makes this year, at least at this particular point in this year, so exciting. To me, it's really about scoring points and how many points you can score. So I'm looking out west and like a team like Washington. And I know that the Penix sometimes can turn the football over, but the points that they put up, they just score a lot, and defense is always important. But I think as they start to set themselves up to be a national championship contender, it's about getting to that point. They're not necessarily going to play teams that are going to have great defenses. So it's going to be about the numbers. So they won't see really, I think, an outstanding team as far as defense is concerned until they make the 14 playoffs, if they're able to do
so
that.
So are neither one of you guys going with Georgia? Because I've always been a big believer in if you are the winner.
Yes.
And you're not losing any games since you've won back-to-back national championships.
You don't drop them.
I'm just not sure. Listen, you can say what you want about South Carolina. South Carolina had some really nice wins last year. They're building a program. That game was on the road. Georgia is breaking in a new quarterback, a very talented guy.
But that wasn't their only
I
struggle.
understand. I just feel like this is a team. Right now, if you went around the country and asked other coaches, if the college football playoff were tomorrow, would you rather play Georgia or would you rather play Florida State? I think most coaches would tell you they would rather play Florida State.
I think that's probably a tough question, though, because Florida State's extremely talented.
No question.
They're much better.
I'm not saying they're a bad team by any stretch of the imagination.
Who would you rather? I just think as we are evaluating it from afar and trying to figure this out, they would for sure be in the playoff. But I do think when the selection committee comes together, they do look at the resume. They look at the data. They look at the strength of schedule. And that's where Georgia and Michigan just don't have it. Again, because games got canceled on them. But you just don't have the data points that you can point to. Because, again, they might be more talented. And they could win once they get to the playoff. But in terms of seeding, and then, I mean, I've done the mock. I just kind of think that way. So maybe that's, I'm a little bit more biased towards the resume for that reason. But that's where Florida State would get the edge. Washington, to your point, has looked the best. Yeah. They haven't had any of those halves that we're talking about with Georgia, any of those sluggish starts. They probably looked the best from the start of the season to date.
I think the most important part about your question is today, right?
It's today.
And I think that's what we have to keep in mind. This all plays out. It really does. But that's why, to me, I said this earlier, to have this many teams playing so well. And I think, listen, Georgia's going to be there at the end because that's who they are. But then can you get there and win it 3 times in a row?
Right. That's
there's
so hard.
Right.
Here's a couple other food for thought points. Ohio State's win is the best win anyone has in the country.
Yes.
Right?
Agree.
Yep.
So that's a major feather in the cap. Notre Dame, I think, will end up being a top 10 team. It's a very talented team. So that's going to be a big one. So Ohio State is going to have multiple potential huge resume-boosting wins.
Yes.
Is Texas's win the second best win out there? You could make that argument, and you guys haven't talked about Texas at all.
Well, Alabama doesn't look very good, right? That's why you kind of got to root for the team you beat to then suddenly continue to look good.
That's why I asked, is it?
Right. And then also in my top 10, I've got 4 Pac-12 teams. So a bunch of them are going to play each other. So those are all going to be good wins in their resumes, but they could also cannibalize each other.
I think the other thing, they all have really, really good quarterbacks.
That's the key, right?
Yep.
Caleb Williams, Michael Penix, J.J. McCarthy,
right.
Travis. You start talking about all these guys.
This is why the SEC is down, by the way, across the board. They don't have those quarterbacks.
They don't have the quarterbacks.
That's an interesting point. For the first time in a long, you know what they do have? Some really good coaches. And I know that doesn't probably go into best team in the country right now in comparison to where they are in the college football playoff. But Kirby Smart gives Georgia an extra edge because he's been there and he's done that over guys like maybe Mike Norvell at Florida State because he hasn't had the opportunity to do that yet with the Seminoles. And again, we'll know more about that come January. It's January. It's too far away.